at you guys. So, all right. When I get nervous, I tend to read fast. I'm gonna try really hard not to do that. Okay, early life, opportunities and hardships. You have a silver tongue and you can sell anybody anything. My family's told me this since I was a very young child. They had good evidence. My earliest memories are categorized by the many apartments my mom moved us to, most of them in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I was wheeling and dealing in all of them, as young as I can remember. I was 6 years old in the mid-1970s, and more than anything, I wanted a bicycle. I craved the freedom and independence of a bike, plus you could do cool tricks on them. In our apartment complexes, kids would leave their bikes parked in the hallways right outside the doorways. If I saw one I wanted to ride, I'd take it. I'd ride it, then leave it at my apartment. Somebody would call and complain, and then I'd get in trouble and give it back. No big deal. A little kid taking a bike, stuff like that happens all the time. But there was more. If I wanted something that belonged to another kid, I could talk them out of their prized possession. I was a first grader wheeling and dealing toys, baseball cards, and really anything that I wanted or could see a way to trade. I quickly learned to capitalize on the opportunity. In those days, a St. Paul police officer would come around and hand out baseball cards to kids. The idea was to build goodwill in the community. One day the officer left his car window open. I'm not sure where he went. A group of us were outside playing, and of course, I had to look inside the vehicle. I mean, it was a cop car. How cool was that? And not only that, there was a stack of baseball cards just sitting on the dashboard. So I saw my opportunity and I took it. Pretty soon I was selling those baseball cards to kids all over the neighborhood. My family was right. I had a silver tongue and I could sell anybody anything. I walked that road for a long time, taking what I wanted and then getting what I wanted for it. It would be another 20 years before I chose an upright path. I eventually got my act together, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit it took a while. My mom was a single parent raising me and my younger brother Chris on welfare and government cheese. She was 16 when I was born, barely more than a kid herself. She married my dad, Richard John, when he got back from Vietnam. Chris, my brother, came along 5 years later. Granted, she did have the support of her parents and a tight-knit family. That made all the difference in my life, especially my grandparents, who I called Mom and Pop. My dad started taking me hunting when I was about 8 or 9 years old. Hunting deer was a big part of his family's culture. He grew up in the Frogtown neighborhood of St. Paul, and for Minnesotans, hunting is a big deal. He had me shoot a 12-gauge double-barrel shotgun for the first time. He took me, and I remember it vividly. It was the first time I ever shot a gun. He told me there were 2 triggers on this double-barrel shotgun, and you're supposed to pull them both at the same time. He put me up next to a tree and told me to pull both barrels, and they both went off, and I slammed hard against the tree and hit the ground. I got up in a daze, and my dad was laughing his ass off. I learned that day that you never pull both triggers at the same time. I also learned that day that my dad had a mean sense of humor. Still, I loved him from the start. Richard was cool. He was a tough guy. He had a certain way about him. I remember one time he drove me across town on the back of his motorcycle. This was before he got into motorcycles real heavy, but I was just a little kid hanging on tight. I loved it. Another time we got up in the morning, we were going to eat peanut butter sandwiches. Just the two of us. I tried so hard to eat more than he did, but I couldn't keep up with him. We also would go camping in his old Volkswagen camper. He took me fishing and hunting. I just loved being with him. It felt good being around my dad. He had a good job, worked as a welder for the Milwaukee Road Railway, which my mom's dad, my grandfather, Edward Dabbs, helped him get when he got back from Vietnam. Richard and I always liked each other right from the start. There was a mutual admiration between the two of us. Even though I was into all kinds of stuff, he was a hard drinker. The Milwaukee Road was bought by the Sioux Line, then the Canadian Pacific, and both my grandfather and my dad retired from there. But to this day, there's a special place in my family's heart for the Milwaukee Road. We all remember it as a family company where the families were valued and supported. Before he worked for the railroad, my grandfather served 22 years in the U.S. military. He served in the Army during World War II and after the war, when the Air Force split off as the newest branch, he went with the Air Force. He had a wife and 5 kids and a family that was stationed all over the place. My mom and her brother and sisters moved around a lot. That was what they knew. So when my mom had me, she kept moving a lot. I can't even recall the apartments we lived in, how many of the apartments we lived in before I was 13 years old. It was just one after another, and usually a new school every time. My mom and I didn't have a very tight bond. She was really young for one. She had trouble with men. She had 2 small kids. She didn't work outside the house. She relied on welfare, sewed her clothes, and scrimped as much as she could. She did her best, but her apartments were stressful places for me to live. But over at my grandparents' house, that felt like family. I even called them Ma and Pa. When they had been married for a long time, and they were a loving, caring parents. When I was young, my oldest uncle, Dennis, was serving in the Navy. Then came my mom, Linda, then Eric, Debbie, and Drusilla. Since mom had me at 16, I was kind of like the 6th kid, born 7 years after my grandparents' youngest, Drusilla. After Pa retired from the military and started working for the railroad, my grandparents settled in St. Paul. I spent a lot of time at their house on the weekends and summer breaks. I can still see Pa lying on the floor in front of the fireplace relaxing. We'd sit down together for nightly dinners. It was a strong family environment. Eric, Debbie, and Drusilla would be there, and so would I, maybe a friend of mine from the neighborhood. Ma would serve roast that had been simmering in the oven all day, plus mashed potatoes and gravy and vegetables. The savory warmth contrasted the thick stench of cigarettes. Ma and Pa were both heavy smokers. Those were the times, and there were ashtrays all over the house. It was hard to breathe in, and I was embarrassed to go to school because I would smell so thick of cigarette smoke. But it was a small price to pay for spending time there. I felt most at home and loved by my grandma and grandpa, Ma and Pa, and that secure feeling has lasted me a lifetime. I give them so much credit for who I am today. It was at their house that I learned to ride a bike, something that has always served me well. I spent hours riding a purple tricycle in their basement. I quickly graduated to 2 wheels. That was a big deal, with Pa outside running just behind me, hand on the seat, sending me off. I remember the feeling of being let go, of riding free. Before I was practicing the tricks I saw other kids in the neighborhood to do on their BMX bikes. One day I was riding alone. Pa was at work. The next block over, I jumped my bike on an uneven spot in the sidewalk. I had jumped it a lot and knew it well. I used it to help me pull my front wheel off the ground and pop wheelies. This time I went really high, only to come down and land smack on my back. I sat up and everything seemed fine until I felt the gushing blood coming from the back of my head. I walked my bike back home, crying, and my grandma freaked out when I came into her kitchen and she saw the blood. She called my grandpa at the Milwaukee Road, but couldn't get a hold of him. Then she called my dad, who was working there as well. She got him on the phone and he came right over and took me to the hospital for stitches. I thought it was so cool that he would leave work to come take care of me. That's it.